The diary entry was written by trembling hands. Second Lieutenant Genjiro Inui of the 8th Independent Anti-Tank Gun Company, August 19, 1942, somewhere in the suffocating jungle of Guadalcanal, recorded words that would haunt him if he survived what was coming. We have been told the Americans are soft, that they will run when we attack at night, that our spirit will overcome their machines. He paused, listening to the jungle sounds around him. 916 other Japanese soldiers were preparing for what Colonel Kiyonao Ichiki promised would be a glorious victory. They had landed hours earlier from destroyers, slipping through the darkness to a beach called Taivu Point. The Americans, Ichiki had told his officers with absolute confidence, numbered maybe 2,000. Garrison troops, poorly trained, easily frightened. "We will sweep them into the sea before sunrise," Ichiki had declared with the certainty of a man who had never tasted defeat. Inui closed his diary and checked his rifle. Around him, veterans of China and Malaya sharpened bayonets, adjusted equipment, prepared for the kind of night attack that had terrified Chinese soldiers, that had broken British defenders in Malaya, that had never once failed to produce complete victory. They were about to discover that the Americans fought very differently. The jungle wouldn't be their ally as it had been in every previous campaign. It would become an American weapon, carefully prepared, methodically turned into killing zones where courage meant nothing and only coordinated firepower determined who lived and who died. The darkness wouldn't hide them as Japanese doctrine promised. It would expose them to machine gun fire that came from positions they couldn't see, fired by men who had waited patiently in prepared positions for Japanese soldiers to walk into zones of destruction. Their courage, their training, their absolute conviction in the superiority of Japanese warrior spirit would lead them directly into the most one-sided slaughter many of them would ever witness. 2 weeks earlier, on August 7, 1942, 11,000 United States Marines of the 1st Marine Division had hit the beaches at Lunga Point like a green wave of determined young men who knew they were making history. General Alexander Vandegrift's Leathernecks were executing Operation Watchtower, the first American offensive operation of the entire Pacific War. Their mission looked deceptively simple when staff officers explained it during briefings aboard the transport ships. Take the Japanese airfield that intelligence reports said was nearly complete, establish a defensive perimeter around it, hold that position against whatever the Japanese threw at them until relieved by follow-on forces. The reality confronting these Marines as they came ashore was infinitely more complex and terrifying than any briefing could convey. Guadalcanal stretched 90 miles in length and 25 miles across at its widest point, its interior dominated by mountains that reached 8,000 feet into clouds that never fully cleared. The coastal plain where the Japanese had been building their airfield was a narrow strip of kunai grass that grew taller than a man's head, fetid swamps that bred disease in standing water, and jungle vegetation so impossibly thick that visibility frequently dropped to mere feet even in full daylight. The heat was a physical force that crushed men under its weight, with temperatures regularly exceeding 100 degrees. Humidity never dropped below 90%, even during the brief nighttime hours that should have brought relief, but instead brought only slightly cooler misery. Mosquitoes swarmed in clouds so dense that men literally inhaled them while trying to breathe, and these weren't merely annoying insects, but disease vectors carrying malaria, dengue fever, and other tropical illnesses that would eventually disable more Marines than Japanese bullets ever would. The rivers and streams that looked clear and inviting on aerial reconnaissance photographs teemed with parasites and microscopic organisms that caused dysentery, tropical ulcers, and infections that turned minor cuts into suppurating wounds that never healed in the constant humidity. But on that first morning of August 7th, when the Marines came ashore expecting fierce resistance, they discovered something unexpected and initially welcome. The Japanese weren't there to fight. 2,200 construction workers and approximately 600 naval troops stationed at the airfield took one look at the massive invasion fleet offshore and the waves of Marines coming ashore, and made the entirely rational decision to run into the jungle interior as fast as their legs would carry them. They abandoned equipment, supplies, food, ammunition, tools, and most critically, the airfield itself, sitting there nearly complete and waiting for whoever wanted to claim it. By nightfall on August 8th, American combat engineers were already working frantically to finish the runway construction using captured Japanese equipment and whatever materials the fleeing construction workers had left behind. They christened the completed facility Henderson Field in honor of Major Lofton Henderson, a Marine aviator who had been killed during the Battle of Midway just 2 months earlier when he pressed home his attack, despite having his aircraft shot to pieces around him. Within days of the runway's completion, the first American aircraft would land on Guadalcanal, and the island would become home to what military historians would later remember with considerable affection as the Cactus Air Force, named for the radio code designation for Guadalcanal itself. The Japanese response to losing the airfield came with devastating swiftness during the night of August 9th, when Vice Admiral Gunichi Mikawa led 7 cruisers and 1 destroyer through the darkness in what would prove to be a brilliantly executed surprise attack that caught Allied naval forces completely unprepared. The Battle of Savo Island lasted less than 1 hour of intense, confused, close-range combat in the darkness. When the guns finally fell silent and the last torpedoes had found their targets, 4 Allied heavy cruisers were sinking into the dark waters around Savo Island. USS Quincy, USS Vincennes, USS Astoria, and the Australian cruiser HMIS Canberra all went to the bottom, taking over 1,000 sailors with them, men who died in burning oil slicks or drowned in the darkness or were blown apart by the massive shells that tore through their ships. The surviving Allied naval forces made the entirely understandable decision to withdraw from the area immediately before Japanese forces could return and finish the job. They took with them the majority of supplies that had not yet been unloaded from transport ships onto Guadalcanal's beaches, leaving the Marines stranded on a hostile island, completely cut off from reinforcement and resupply, facing an enemy who would certainly return in force, possessing barely half their planned equipment and perhaps a third of the food supplies they were supposed to have for sustained operations. What the Japanese High Command failed to understand during those critical early days of August was that Henderson Field had become the key to absolutely everything that would follow in the campaign. Whoever controlled that airfield controlled the surrounding seas during daylight hours when aircraft could operate effectively. Aircraft taking off from Henderson Field could strike any Japanese ship attempting to approach within 200 miles of Guadalcanal, which meant Japanese naval forces attempting daylight operations in the area were essentially committing suicide. This single geographical and tactical reality would dictate the entire nature of the campaign that developed over the following months. The Japanese discovered they could own the night, sending in troops and supplies aboard fast destroyers in runs that American forces began calling the Tokyo Express, or sometimes the Rat Run, ships racing in under cover of darkness, frantically unloading whatever men and materials they carried, then racing back out before dawn brought American aircraft that would blow them out of the water. But when each dawn broke over Guadalcanal, American aircraft ruled the skies completely, making any Japanese movement by sea during daylight hours absolutely impossible without accepting catastrophic losses. The strategic situation, as analyzed by staff officers at Imperial General Headquarters in Tokyo, seemed to demand immediate action. Japan needed to retake Henderson Field right now, this instant, before American forces could dig in properly and fortify their positions to the point where dislodging them would require a major campaign. The assignment went to Lieutenant General Harukichi Hyakutake's 17th Army based at Rabaul. But Hyakutake immediately discovered he had a problem with available forces. The 35th Infantry Brigade, under Major General Kiyotake Kawaguchi, was stationed way out at Palau. The 4th Infantry Regiment remained tied down on occupation duty in the Philippines. The only unit immediately available and close enough to deploy quickly was Colonel Kiyonao Ichiki's 28th Infantry Regiment, which had been stationed near Guam preparing for the Midway operation that got canceled after the naval disaster in June. Colonel Ichiki seemed perfect for the job in every way that mattered to Japanese military thinking. He was an infantry school instructor with an established reputation as a first-rate tactician who understood modern warfare. He was known for being aggressive and decisive in combat. He possessed supreme confidence that Japanese fighting spirit and superior training would overcome whatever material advantages the Americans might possess. Before his regiment departed from Truk Atoll heading for Guadalcanal, Ichiki received explicit written orders from higher headquarters instructing him in the clearest possible language to wait for the remainder of his regiment to arrive and concentrate before attempting any attack on American positions around Henderson Field. But Ichiki had very little respect for American soldiers, based on everything he had read in intelligence summaries and after-action reports from every theater where Japanese forces had encountered Western troops. The Americans lacked discipline, according to these reports. They broke under sustained pressure and aggressive attacks. They couldn't possibly match Japanese warriors in the kind of close combat where spiritual power and expertise with bayonets determined outcomes rather than industrial firepower. 6 Japanese destroyers delivered 917 men of Ichiki's first echelon to Taivu Point on the night of August 18th, a landing conducted with such perfect stealth that American forces had absolutely no idea it had occurred. Ichiki immediately sent out reconnaissance patrols to gather intelligence on enemy strength, defensive positions, and the general situation around Henderson Field. It was completely routine, exactly what doctrine prescribed, and it would prove absolutely fatal to his entire force. On August 19th, a patrol from Company A of the 1st Battalion, 1st Marines under Captain Charles Brush, was conducting a routine reconnaissance mission along the coastal track toward Coley Point when they unexpectedly spotted Japanese soldiers moving through the jungle ahead of them. The two forces collided in a brief but incredibly vicious firefight at close range where there was no room for maneuver and no time for anything except immediate violent action. When the shooting stopped and the smoke cleared, 31 Japanese soldiers lay dead, and the Marines were gathering up documents from the bodies, including maps, orders, and intelligence summaries that revealed far more than the dead Japanese soldiers would ever have wanted to give away. Captain Brush read through the captured papers with growing alarm as he realized what he was looking at. There was a significant Japanese force concentrating in the area, probably regimental strength or close to it. More alarming still, Japanese intelligence had severely and catastrophically underestimated American strength on Guadalcanal by what looked like a factor of at least 5 or 6 times actual numbers. Brush didn't waste a single second. He grabbed the captured documents and ran back to the American defensive perimeter as fast as his legs would carry him to brief General Vandegrift personally on what his patrol had discovered. Vandegrift was a combat veteran who had spent his entire adult life studying warfare, and he understood immediately exactly what the intelligence meant without needing lengthy explanations or analysis. The Japanese were going to attack soon, probably within the next 24 to 48 hours. The attack would almost certainly come from the eastern approach where Brush had made contact. The Japanese commander would likely attack at night, using the kind of aggressive tactics that had worked so brilliantly for Japanese forces in every previous campaign. Vandegrift immediately ordered Colonel Clifton Cates to strengthen defensive positions along the sandbar at the mouth of what the Marines were calling the Tenaru River, though it was actually the Ilu River, but the misidentification would become permanent in every subsequent historical account of what happened there. Cates deployed Lieutenant Colonel Leonard Creswell's 2nd Battalion, 1st Marines along the riverbank with specific instructions to prepare the position as if they were expecting a major attack, because they almost certainly were. The Marines positioned M1917A1 Browning water-cooled machine guns with meticulous care to create interlocking fields of fire across every inch of the sandbar that formed the most obvious avenue of approach. These weapons had been designed and perfected during World War I and refined over 2 decades of peacetime development, and they were about to demonstrate why the Browning machine gun was considered one of the finest weapons ever created for sustained defensive fire. Each gun could maintain a rate of 600 rounds per minute, essentially forever, as long as the water jacket surrounding the barrel stayed filled to prevent overheating, and as long as ammunition belts kept feeding into the mechanism. The Marines positioned these weapons in mutually supporting locations, calculated with geometric precision so that absolutely no area of the sandbar remained uncovered by converging fire from at least 2 different guns simultaneously. 37mm anti-tank guns were brought up and positioned to cover the likely approaches, loaded with canister rounds that were essentially enormous shotgun shells, packed with hundreds of small steel balls that would turn living men into shredded meat at close range. Artillery crews from the 11th Marines registered their weapons on likely assembly areas and approach routes, plotting coordinates so they could deliver fire missions instantly when called upon. Everything was prepared with the kind of methodical attention to detail that characterized American defensive doctrine, creating not just a defensive line, but a carefully designed killing zone where every weapon supported every other weapon and where anyone entering that zone would find themselves under fire from multiple directions simultaneously. Colonel Ichiki, sitting in his command post 15 miles away at Taivu Point, made a decision that would doom his entire force. Rather than waiting for intelligence reports from his reconnaissance patrol that had failed to return, rather than waiting for the reinforcements that headquarters had explicitly ordered him to await before attacking, he decided to attack immediately with the forces currently under his command. Japanese military doctrine emphasized the absolute superiority of spiritual power and morale over material factors. Aggressive night attacks delivered with overwhelming determination and fighting spirit could overcome enemy firepower advantages through shock, surprise, and the sheer audacity of warriors willing to die for their emperor and their nation. Ichiki believed with absolute conviction that his veterans, men who had fought in China and Malaya and who had never tasted defeat, could break through whatever defenses these soft American garrison troops had managed to throw together. Close quarters fighting where Japanese soldiers excelled with bayonets and grenades, and hand-to-hand combat would decide the battle, And in that kind of fighting, Japanese warriors had no equals anywhere in the world. Just after midnight on the night of August 20th, transitioning into the early morning hours of August 21st, a Solomon Islander named Jacob Vuza stumbled into Marine defensive lines in terrible condition, his body showing clear evidence of brutal torture, including bayonet wounds that should have killed him hours earlier. Vuza had been captured by Japanese forces while conducting reconnaissance for the Americans, and his captors had tortured him for hours, trying to extract information about Marine positions and strength. When torture failed to break him, they had bayoneted him repeatedly and left him to die. Somehow Vuza had survived, freed himself from his bonds, and crawled and stumbled through miles of jungle to reach Marine lines with a desperate warning. The Japanese were coming right now, hundreds of them, maybe 1,000, assault troops preparing to attack across the sandbar. Minutes after Vuza delivered his warning and was rushed to medical treatment that would save his life, the Japanese attack began exactly as he had described. Hundreds of Japanese soldiers charged directly across the exposed sandbar, screaming battle cries designed to intimidate and terrify. Defenders, firing rifles from the hip as they ran forward, hurling grenades toward Marine positions they could barely see in the darkness. They ran directly into what the Marines had spent hours preparing, a killing zone designed with geometric precision and supported by firepower that Japanese doctrine had never properly accounted for in its calculations about spiritual power overcoming material advantages. The M1917AE-1 Browning machine guns opened fire simultaneously from multiple carefully prepared positions, and the sound was like nothing the attacking Japanese soldiers had ever experienced in previous campaigns. Not the sporadic defensive fire of Chinese troops whose weapons jammed and who broke under aggressive attacks. Not the scattered resistance of British defenders in Malaya who had been outmaneuvered and demoralized before Japanese forces even made contact. This was systematic, coordinated, overwhelming defensive fire delivered by weapons that simply did not stop firing, that never jammed, that never paused except to change ammunition belts, that poured out steady streams of heavy .30 caliber rounds that tore through human flesh and shattered bone and killed with mechanical efficiency. Japanese soldiers fell in waves, literally in waves like wheat before a scythe, as the interlocking machine gun fire swept across the sandbar, catching men in crossfires where bullets came from multiple directions simultaneously. Those who somehow made it across the sandbar through that hurricane of machine gun fire encountered the 37mm guns firing their canister rounds at point-blank range, and these weapons didn't wound men or force them to take cover. They simply erased them from existence in clouds of blood mist and shredded flesh. The Japanese attack continued for hours, despite casualties that should have broken any assault within minutes. Wave after wave of soldiers charged into the machine gun fire, following orders, following doctrine, following the training that promised spiritual power would overcome material obstacles. Some actually made it to Marine positions and engaged in the kind of hand-to-hand combat where Japanese soldiers were supposed to excel. Marines fought back with rifles, knives, entrenching tools, fists, anything they could grab, and they discovered that Japanese soldiers died just as easily as anyone else when you shot them or stabbed them or hit them hard enough with something heavy. The defensive preparations held through the night despite Japanese soldiers fighting with a determination and courage that earned grudging respect even from Marines who were killing them as fast as they appeared. The interlocking fields of fire prevented any breakthrough despite numerous attempts. Artillery from the 11th Marines dropped high explosive shells on Japanese assembly areas identified by observers, breaking up concentrations before they could launch coordinated attacks. As dawn approached on August 21st, Colonel Ichiki's assault had completely stalled, with more than 800 of his men lying dead or dying on the sandbar, in the shallow water, scattered through the coconut groves where they had tried to take cover from the relentless machine gun fire. Daybreak brought no relief for the surviving Japanese soldiers, but instead brought something far worse. General Vandegrift ordered a counterattack using elements of the 1st Battalion, 1st Marines, supported by 5 M3 Stuart light tanks that crossed the sandbar and began systematically hunting down Japanese soldiers who had taken cover anywhere they could find it. War correspondent Richard Tregaskis, watching from a Marine observation position, would later write a description that captured the mechanical brutality of what he witnessed. The tanks moved through the coconut groves like predators, pivoting, turning, spitting sheets of yellow flame from their machine guns and 37mm main guns. Groups of Japanese soldiers were flushed out from cover and shot down, and more groups appeared from places nobody had expected them to be hiding, and the tanks killed them all with methodical efficiency. By midday on August 21st, the battle that history would remember as the Battle of the Tenaru was completely over. Of the 917 Japanese soldiers who had landed at Taivu Point with such confidence just 3 days earlier, approximately 800 were dead. Roughly 128 survivors, mostly from support units that had remained near the original landing site rather than participating in the assault, melted into the jungle and would eventually send a radio message back to 17th Army headquarters at Rabaul, reporting the complete disaster. Among the dead was Colonel Ichiki himself, though accounts differ significantly on exactly how he died. The official Japanese version claimed he ceremonially burned his regimental colors and then committed ritual suicide as honor demanded when a commander had failed so catastrophically. Some American witnesses insisted they saw him die, leading a final desperate charge into Marine positions. The truth died with Ichiki and was probably less important than the fact that an entire regiment had been essentially annihilated in a single night of combat. Marine casualties were approximately 40 men killed and wounded total, a ratio so lopsided that it seemed almost impossible to believe until you examined the battlefield and understood what concentrated defensive firepower could do to troops attacking across open ground into prepared positions. The psychological impact on the surviving Japanese soldiers who heard about the disaster was absolutely devastating in ways that went far beyond simple military defeat. Captured documents recovered later in the campaign and post-war interviews with Japanese veterans who had served on Guadalcanal revealed the profound shock of learning that an entire regiment of veteran troops had been annihilated in a few hours by enemy forces that Japanese doctrine had dismissed as inferior. The Americans had not fought the way Japanese intelligence summaries and training manuals said they would fight. They had not panicked when attacked at night by screaming warriors charging with fixed bayonets. They had not broken and run when Japanese soldiers pressed home their attacks with the kind of aggressive spirit that had shattered Chinese and British defenders. Instead, the Americans had waited calmly in carefully prepared positions, had allowed Japanese forces to enter killing zones that had been planned and registered and prepared with meticulous attention to detail, and had then systematically destroyed attacking forces with concentrated firepower delivered by weapons that never seemed to jam or run out of ammunition. The most devastating revelation for Japanese military analysts examining the aftermath came from assessing captured American equipment and studying the battlefield itself. The Americans possessed a level of material wealth and industrial capacity the Japanese intelligence had completely and catastrophically failed to comprehend or communicate to field commanders. The Browning machine guns that had done most of the killing never jammed during the entire night of sustained firing. They never overheated beyond their design capacity despite firing thousands of rounds. They never failed from poor maintenance or inadequate spare parts or any of the myriad problems that plague Japanese weapons when subjected to sustained use. Every Marine seemed to carry more ammunition as an individual soldier than an entire Japanese squad carried collectively. The artillery support that Marines could call down on Japanese positions with a simple radio call exceeded anything Japanese forces could hope to deploy given their logistical constraints. The coordination between infantry, artillery, and even naval gunfire from ships standing offshore represented an integrated system of destruction that Japanese forces had simply never encountered in any previous campaign against any previous enemy. Within days of the Tenaru disaster, more Japanese forces were already en route to Guadalcanal because Imperial headquarters could not accept that the island was lost and Henderson Field would remain in American hands. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, commander of the combined fleet, organized a massive naval operation to support the next attempt to retake the airfield from American control. 3 slow transport ships departed Truk on August 16th, carrying the remaining 1,400 soldiers from Ichiki's regiment who had not participated in the first landing, plus 500 naval infantry troops. After a naval battle called the Eastern Solomons resulted in heavy damage to one of these transports, Japanese command made the critical decision to abandon slow transport ships entirely for future supply runs. Instead, they would rely exclusively on destroyers for what became universally known throughout both forces as the Tokyo Express, ships that could make the round trip from the Shortland Islands to Guadalcanal in a single night, minimizing exposure to American air attacks during daylight hours. Between August 29th and September 4th, various destroyers and light cruisers delivered almost 5,000 troops belonging to Major General Kawaguchi's 35th Infantry Brigade to Taivu Point using this method. The Tokyo Express worked brilliantly as a method for moving men quickly and with relatively low risk of interception. Destroyers were fast enough to make the run under cover of darkness, and American aircraft based at Henderson Field couldn't effectively intercept them during the few hours of darkness when they were actually vulnerable. But the method had one absolutely critical and ultimately fatal weakness that would doom every subsequent Japanese offensive on Guadalcanal. Heavy equipment simply could not be transported this way. Artillery pieces that required loading by crane, tanks that weighed multiple tons, trucks for logistics, and most importantly, adequate stockpiles of food and ammunition all had to be left behind because destroyer decks couldn't accommodate them. This logistical reality meant that Japanese soldiers arrived on Guadalcanal carrying only what they could personally carry on their backs. They would have to depend on whatever they could forage locally from the jungle, and whatever minimal supplies could be infiltrated through American lines or delivered on subsequent destroyer runs that were already overloaded with fresh troops. As the campaign wore on through August and September and into October, Japanese troops would find themselves fighting not just against overwhelming American firepower, but against starvation itself. And starvation would prove just as deadly as any weapon the Marines carried. General Kawaguchi set September 12th as the target date for his assault on Henderson Field, after his forces had time to concentrate, conduct reconnaissance, and prepare detailed plans. His operational concept called for a three-pronged attack designed to split American defenses and prevent them from concentrating their forces. One element would strike from the west along the coastal area where the terrain was relatively open. A second force would attack from the south, penetrating through the dense jungle to strike at what Japanese intelligence assessments suggested was the weakest point in American defensive preparations. Kawaguchi himself would lead the main effort approaching from the south along an inland ridge that dominated Henderson Field and provided observation over the entire American position. What Kawaguchi could not have known was that Marine intelligence had already identified this ridge as the single most likely avenue of approach for any serious Japanese attack coming from the south. Lieutenant Colonel Merritt Edson, commanding officer of the 1st Raider Battalion, had conducted a combat raid on Tasimboko village on September 8th and discovered massive supply dumps there, huge stockpiles of food, ammunition, and equipment, indicating that a large Japanese force was definitely concentrating in the area and preparing for major operations. Edson immediately understood with perfect clarity what the Japanese operational plan had to be. They would come from the south through the jungle, using that ridge as their primary approach route, because it was simply the best terrain available for moving large numbers of troops. Edson requested permission from General Vandegrift to establish a defensive line on the ridge itself, rather than waiting for Japanese forces to approach closer to Henderson Field. Vandegrift approved without hesitation because he trusted Edson's tactical judgment completely. On September 10th and 11th, Edson positioned approximately 840 Marines from his Raider Battalion and the 1st Parachute Battalion along the ridge, using the same methodical approach to defensive preparation that had worked so devastatingly well at the Tanaru. Machine guns were positioned to create interlocking fields of fire across every likely approach route. Mortar crews registered their weapons on terrain features where Japanese forces would likely assemble or attempt to penetrate. Artillery crews from the 11th Marines plotted defensive fire missions on coordinates all along the ridge and in the ravines on both sides. Every possible advantage of terrain and every ounce of available firepower was calculated, planned, registered, and prepared with obsessive attention to detail. The ridge itself was a narrow coral spine running approximately 1,000 meters in length, consisting of 3 distinct hills covered with kunai grass and scattered coconut palms. Deep ravines bordered both sides of the ridge, heavily wooded with vegetation so thick it was nearly impenetrable in places, perfect terrain for infiltration attacks by small units moving under cover of darkness. It was absolutely ideal ground for Japanese night attack tactics that emphasized infiltration, envelopment, and close combat. It was also, if properly defended with adequate firepower and competent troops, an absolutely perfect killing ground where attackers would be channeled into predetermined zones and destroyed with concentrated fire. On the night of September 12th, Kawaguchi's forces began their assault using tactics that were far more sophisticated than Ichiki's simple frontal charge at the Tenaru. Japanese infantry infiltrated through the ravines on both sides of the ridge, small units probing constantly for weak points in Marine defenses. When they discovered what they thought were gaps or lightly defended areas, larger forces would concentrate there for breakthrough attempts designed to penetrate deep into American positions. The fighting that developed was savage, confused, and conducted almost entirely in darkness where visibility dropped to mere feet, and men fought each other at ranges where you could smell your enemy's breath. Marines sometimes found themselves engaged in hand-to-hand combat with Japanese soldiers who had infiltrated to within grenade-throwing range of command posts and communication centers. but the defensive preparations that Edson had insisted upon held through the chaos. When Japanese forces concentrated for breakthrough attempts that should have overwhelmed isolated Marine positions, Marine mortars and artillery shattered those concentrations with high explosive shells that arrived within seconds of fire missions being called. The 11th Marines fired more than 2,000 artillery rounds during that single night, dropping shells so close to Marine positions that shrapnel from their own artillery wounded American troops fighting on the ridge. Machine gun crews fired continuously until their weapons' barrels glowed cherry red in the darkness, visible as glowing lines in the night. Individual Marines fought with whatever came to hand. When Japanese soldiers closed to contact distance, rifles, pistols, knives, entrenching tools, fists, rocks, anything that could kill or wound or drive back attackers who kept coming, despite casualties that should have broken any attack. Sergeant Major Jacob Vuza, the same Solomon Islander scout who had warned the Marines about Ichiki's attack at the Tenaru, despite being tortured nearly to death, moved through the Marine lines throughout the night, pointing out Japanese infiltration routes, encouraging defenders, helping coordinate the defense with knowledge of terrain that American maps couldn't provide. Sergeant John Basilone, who would later become legendary throughout the Marine Corps, manned a machine gun position that became absolutely critical to holding the center of the defensive line. When members of his gun crew were killed or wounded by Japanese fire or grenade fragments, Basilone continued firing alone, servicing the weapon by himself, repelling wave after wave of Japanese attacks that tried desperately to overrun his position. He would later receive the Medal of Honor for his actions that night, one of 2 Marines who would earn the medal at Edson's Ridge, with 19 more receiving the Navy Cross for extraordinary heroism. As dawn broke on September 13th, the Japanese attack had failed to achieve the breakthrough that Kawaguchi needed, but he still had substantial forces available and prepared orders for renewing the assault the following night. Edson responded by pulling his defensive lines back slightly to the center of the ridge, consolidating his forces into a tighter perimeter that would be even harder to penetrate. General Vandegrift sent reinforcements forward, bringing the total defending force to approximately 2,500 men with additional artillery support. The Japanese would attack again the following night, but this time the Marines would be waiting in even stronger positions with more concentrated firepower and clearer fields of fire. The second night's fighting on September 13th, transitioning into September 14th, was even more intense than the previous night, if that was possible. Kawaguchi threw his remaining forces into desperate attempts to break through Marine defenses before American reinforcements and resupply made the position completely impregnable to assault. Japanese soldiers charged repeatedly through the darkness, dying by the hundreds in concentrated machine gun fire, artillery bursts, and close-range combat that left both sides with casualties that would have seemed impossible before experiencing it firsthand. Some Japanese attacks penetrated to within 50 yards of Edson's command post before being stopped by final defensive fires delivered at point-blank range. At one critical moment when the situation appeared desperate and breakthrough seemed possible, Edson himself grabbed a rifle and joined the firing line, personally leading the defense of his command post. But again, just as at the Tenaru, American firepower and defensive preparation ultimately prevailed over Japanese determination and tactical skill. By dawn on September 14th, Kawaguchi's offensive had completely collapsed with his forces scattered, disorganized, and combat ineffective. Japanese casualties were absolutely staggering in their scope. Approximately 830 to 850 Japanese soldiers died on and around the ridge that would forever after be known as Bloody Ridge or Edson's Ridge, a monument to the effectiveness of American defensive doctrine when executed by competent troops with adequate firepower. Marine casualties totaled approximately 104 killed and over 200 wounded between the Raider and Parachute battalions, severe losses but sustainable given the size of American forces on the island and the constant flow of replacements arriving by sea. For Japanese soldiers who survived the nightmare of those 2 nights, the battle represented another profound psychological shock to their understanding of how warfare was supposed to work. Captured diaries recovered later in the campaign and post-war accounts from Japanese veterans who had been present consistently described the same fundamental realization hitting them during and after the battle. Japanese forces had expected to fight other infantry in darkness, where superior training in night combat tactics and unbreakable fighting spirit would produce victory regardless of material disadvantages. Instead, they had encountered artillery fire, machine gun fire, and mortar fire, all concentrated with a precision they simply could not match given their limited support weapons and chronic ammunition shortages. American commanders had known the Japanese were coming hours before the attack began. They had prepared killing zones with geometric precision. They had waited patiently for Japanese forces to enter those zones. Then they had methodically destroyed attacking. Forces with coordinated fire support that never seemed to run out of ammunition or lose its effectiveness. The battles at the Tenaru and at Bloody Ridge established patterns and revealed truths that would repeat themselves throughout the remainder of the Guadalcanal campaign with mechanical predictability. Japanese forces would launch attacks based on courage, superior night fighting skills, and expertise in close combat where they believed Japanese warriors had no equals. American forces would respond with overwhelming firepower delivered through carefully coordinated combined arms operations and defensive positions prepared specifically to maximize American advantages while minimizing Japanese strengths. The outcome became predictable once you understood the pattern. Japanese casualties would be catastrophic, often exceeding 50% or more of attacking forces. American casualties would be significant but sustainable, given the constant flow of replacements and supplies. But raw numbers and statistics alone cannot possibly capture the absolute horror of jungle warfare on Guadalcanal, as experienced by the men actually fighting there, day after day, week after week, month after month. The environment itself became a weapon that killed with complete impartiality, caring nothing for nationality or which side you fought for. Malaria infected nearly every single man who spent more than a few weeks on the island, regardless of what precautions they took or what preventive medications they consumed. By December 1942, the 1st Marine Division would officially report over 8,000 documented malaria cases among troops who had served on the island, and that number represented only cases severe enough to require medical treatment, not the countless thousands more who fought through fever and chills while still carrying out their combat duties. Tropical diseases disabled approximately 2/3 of the entire division over the course of the campaign. Dysentery was essentially universal, every man suffering from it to some degree at some point. Men endured fungal infections that literally ate through skin, creating open sores that refused to heal in the humid heat. Jungle rot caused wounds that festered and spread, despite whatever treatments medics attempted. Dental problems with absolutely no treatment available led to abscessed teeth that caused systemic infections serious enough to kill. The Japanese forces suffered even worse conditions, if that was possible to imagine. Their supply situation deteriorated from merely inadequate in August to absolutely catastrophic by October and November. Soldiers were theoretically supposed to receive field rations consisting of rice, canned meat, and various supplements, but the Tokyo Express destroyer runs could rarely deliver enough food for the forces actually present on the island. Men subsisted on whatever they could forage from the jungle, supplemented by occasional rice deliveries that had to be stretched impossibly thin across thousands of starving troops. Starvation became a constant companion for Japanese soldiers, more real and more immediate than the American enemy they were supposedly fighting. Medical supplies ran out almost immediately and were never adequately replenished despite desperate requests to headquarters. Quinine for malaria prevention disappeared within weeks of the campaign beginning. Wounded soldiers often died from infections that would have been easily treatable with basic antibiotics or proper surgical care, neither of which was available. Japanese medical reports captured later in the campaign painted a picture so horrifying it seemed almost impossible to believe until you read multiple sources all describing the same nightmare conditions. A medical officer's report from late October noted with clinical precision that more than 60% of 17th Army's forces on Guadalcanal were completely incapacitated by disease or malnutrition, unable to perform any military duties whatsoever. Combat effectiveness had dropped to perhaps 30% of authorized strength. Soldiers were dying at a rate of approximately 50 per day, and most of those deaths came from starvation and disease rather than American bullets or shells. By contrast, American supply ships protected by aircraft operating from Henderson Field during daylight hours regularly delivered food, ammunition, medical supplies, and replacement equipment directly to the beaches. Shortages definitely occurred, particularly in August and early September, when naval defeats had temporarily left the Marines cut off from resupply, but these shortages were temporary disruptions rather than permanent conditions. By October, the flow of supplies had become reliable enough that Marines could count on regular meals even if the food wasn't particularly appealing. Marines ate canned rations that nobody would describe as delicious, but which provided adequate calories and nutrition to sustain combat operations. Ammunition was plentiful enough that machine gunners could fire until their barrels literally wore out from sustained use, then simply request replacement barrels from supply. Medical care included field hospitals with actual surgical capabilities, plasma for blood transfusions when needed, sulfa drugs for fighting infections, and eventual evacuation of serious casualties to rear area hospitals where proper treatment was available. Japanese logistics, by comparison, consisted of whatever could be physically carried on destroyer decks during nighttime runs, or whatever could be infiltrated through American lines by small groups moving through the jungle. Soldiers learned to make a single rice ball last an entire day through sheer necessity, because there simply wasn't any more food available. Ammunition conservation became so critical that orders often restricted firing to only when absolutely necessary, because there was no guarantee of resupply. Medical care meant a bandage if you were extremely lucky, amputation without anesthesia performed by a medical orderly with a saw if you were unlucky enough to suffer a severe wound, or simply death if your wound became infected because there were no antibiotics or disinfectants available. Seriously wounded soldiers were often given grenades and left behind when units had to move, because carrying wounded men through the jungle was physically impossible, and leaving them alive risked them being captured and interrogated by Americans, so the merciful solution was to give them the means to commit suicide and hope they had the courage to use it when American patrols approached. In late October, the Japanese mounted what would be their largest and most ambitious offensive of the entire Guadalcanal campaign. General Hyakutake himself came to Guadalcanal from Rabaul to personally command the operation, bringing with him elements of the 2nd Division, including experienced troops who had fought in China. The operational plan called for carefully coordinated attacks coming from multiple directions, simultaneously with the main effort coming from the south through dense jungle, using an approach similar to the one Kawaguchi had attempted at Bloody Ridge. This time, however, Japanese forces would have more men available, supposedly better coordination between attacking elements, and most importantly, artillery support that had finally been delivered to the island via destroyer runs despite enormous difficulty. The offensive operation began on October 23rd with a preliminary diversionary attack launched from the west designed to draw American attention and reserves away from the main effort. 9 Japanese tanks, extraordinarily rare on Guadalcanal because of the immense difficulty involved in transporting such heavy equipment via destroyer, led an assault force across the Matanikau River into American defensive positions. American defenders, including elements of the newly arrived 164th Infantry Regiment from the Americal Division, were ready and waiting in prepared positions. Anti-tank guns, artillery fire, and even a single M3 Stuart light tank engaged the Japanese armor at close range and knocked out all 9 enemy tanks in quick succession. The attack collapsed with heavy casualties, accomplishing absolutely nothing except alerting American commanders that something larger was definitely coming. The main assault came on the night of October 24th, transitioning into October 25th, when approximately 5,600 Japanese troops under Major General Yumio Nasu attacked from the south, hoping to break through American defensive lines positioned south of Henderson Field. They faced the 1st Battalion, 7th Marines under Lieutenant Colonel Louis Chesty Puller, who would become one of the most decorated Marines in history, reinforced by elements of the 164th Infantry Regiment, providing additional firepower and manpower. The fighting that developed that night would become absolutely legendary in Marine Corps history, studied for decades afterward in military schools as an example of defensive combat conducted under the most difficult possible conditions. Japanese attacks came in waves throughout the entire night, hundreds of men at a time charging into defensive positions, some attacks actually achieving temporary breakthroughs that had to be sealed immediately by violent counterattacks before they could be exploited. Machine gunners fired continuously until their weapons failed from overheating or mechanical breakdowns, then grabbed rifles and continued fighting as riflemen. Artillery crews from the 11th Marines fired danger-close missions that landed high explosive shells within yards of Marine defensive positions, killing Japanese attackers but occasionally wounding Marines with shrapnel from their own artillery. Offshore in the darkness, the battleship USS Washington stood by monitoring radio communications, ready to provide massive naval gunfire support with her 16-inch guns if the situation became desperate enough to risk firing that close to friendly forces. At one critical moment during the night, only a single Marine battalion stood between concentrated Japanese forces and Henderson Field itself, but that battalion did not break, did not retreat, held its positions, and killed Japanese soldiers as fast as they appeared in the darkness. Sergeant John Basilone, who had already distinguished himself at Bloody Ridge, earning a Medal of Honor recommendation, again became absolutely critical to the defense when his machine gun section found itself at the focal point of repeated Japanese attacks. When ammunition began running low because sustained firing had consumed thousands of rounds, Bess alone personally carried ammunition through enemy fire to keep his guns operational, making multiple trips while bullets cracked past him and grenades exploded nearby. He repaired damaged machine guns under fire using spare parts and improvised tools. When one gun position was overrun by Japanese soldiers in a brief breakthrough, Basilone grabbed a .45 caliber pistol and personally led an immediate counterattack that restored the defensive line and killed the Japanese troops who had penetrated. By dawn on October 25th, the Japanese offensive had failed completely and catastrophically. General Nasu lay dead, killed by machine gun fire during one of the night attacks when he had personally led his troops forward. More than 2,000 Japanese soldiers died in the attempt to break through marine defenses, their bodies scattered across the jungle and piled in heaps where concentrated fire had caught them. American casualties numbered several hundred killed and wounded, losses that were severe and painful but sustainable given the constant arrival of replacements and the fact that American forces still controlled Henderson Field and everything that implied. October and November 1942 also witnessed major naval engagements that would decisively shift the balance of power in the waters around Guadalcanal. The naval battle of Guadalcanal, fought over 4 days from November 12th through November 15th, saw some of the most intense and confused surface combat in the entire history of naval warfare. In a chaotic nighttime melee on November 9th, where visibility was measured in hundreds of yards and ships fired at point-blank range, American cruisers and destroyers engaged a Japanese bombardment force that included the battleships Hiei and Kirishima, attempting to shell Henderson Field into rubble. Rear Admiral Daniel Callahan and Rear Admiral Norman Scott, the only 2 American flag officers killed in World War II surface engagements, both died during the confused fighting when their flagships were destroyed by Japanese fire. The Americans lost 2 light cruisers and 4 destroyers sunk with 3 more destroyers heavily damaged, but the Japanese lost the battleship Hiei, disabled during the night action and then sunk by American aircraft the following day when she couldn't escape before dawn. More importantly for the campaign's outcome, the Japanese bombardment mission failed completely. Henderson Field remained operational, and American aircraft continued flying from it. On the night of November 14th into November 15th, the battleship Kirishima attempted another bombardment run, hoping to succeed where the previous attempt had failed, but she was intercepted by the American battleships USS Washington and USS South Dakota, in what would become a textbook demonstration of radar-directed gunnery. In a devastating display of American technological superiority, Washington put 9 16-inch armor-piercing shells into Kirishima at ranges where Japanese lookouts could barely see their target through the darkness, while American radar operators tracked the enemy ship with perfect precision. Kirishima sank shortly afterward with heavy loss of life, and the Japanese Navy would never again attempt a battleship bombardment of Henderson Field. Perhaps most significantly for the ground campaign, American aircraft operating from Henderson Field and surface ships operating nearby destroyed a major Japanese convoy attempting to land the entire 38th Division with all its heavy equipment and supplies. 11 transport ships loaded with troops and equipment had departed from the Shortland Islands, but American forces intercepted them during daylight when aircraft could operate with devastating effectiveness. Of the 11 transports, only 4 actually reached Guadalcanal's beaches, and these were systematically destroyed by aircraft and artillery fire before they could completely unload their cargoes. Japanese casualties from the convoy operation exceeded 5,000 men killed or drowned, and the equipment losses were catastrophic, representing the complete destruction of an entire division's worth of artillery, vehicles, and supplies. This was the last serious attempt to reinforce Guadalcanal with a large, properly equipped ground force capable of sustained offensive operations. For Japanese troops already fighting and starving on the island, November marked the beginning of the end of any realistic hope for victory or even survival. They had expected significant reinforcement and resupply to enable renewed offensives. Instead, they learned through monitoring radio communications that the naval battles had failed, that the convoys carrying desperately needed supplies and reinforcements had been destroyed, that no more substantial help was coming from Rabaul. Rations that were already inadequate were reduced again to impossibly low levels. Already starving men were told they would have to survive on even less food because there simply wasn't any more available. Medical supplies that had been critically short for months became completely non-existent. The sick and wounded filled makeshift field hospitals where doctors and medical orderlies could do absolutely nothing except watch men die slowly from wounds and diseases that would have been easily treatable with basic medical care. Captured Japanese diaries from this November-December period painted a picture of slow organizational collapse and individual desperation. Diary entries described with increasingly frantic language how rice rations had been reduced to one small ball per day, barely enough to sustain life, let alone support combat operations. Disease was spreading everywhere through units with no medications available to treat it. Bodies were burned when soldiers had enough strength left to gather wood and perform cremations. The terrible realization was slowly spreading through the ranks that no more supplies were coming, that headquarters had essentially abandoned them. Men were eating grass and tree bark, trying to find anything that might provide calories. Deaths from accidentally consuming poisonous plants were becoming common. The deterioration of once proud soldiers into desperate, starving shadows of their former selves was happening with horrifying speed. December brought the final reckoning when Japanese command at Rabaul made the agonizing but inevitable decision to evacuate Guadalcanal entirely. They could not publicly admit defeat because Japanese military culture simply did not permit such admissions, but privately, senior officers recognized that continuing operations on Guadalcanal meant the complete annihilation of the entire 17th Army through starvation, if nothing else. Approximately 11,000 Japanese soldiers remained alive on the island, down from a peak strength that had exceeded 36,000 at various points during the campaign. Of those 11,000 survivors, perhaps 7,000 were physically capable of walking under their own power. The remainder were so sick, so wounded, or so weakened by starvation that they could barely crawl, let alone conduct military operations. The evacuation designated Operation Ole K would prove to be one of the most successful Japanese operations of the entire war, a remarkable achievement under extraordinarily difficult circumstances. Using destroyer runs similar to the Tokyo Express but now operating to extract troops rather than deliver them, Japanese naval forces successfully evacuated 10,652 men over 3 nights in early February 1943. It was a remarkable logistical and naval achievement that demonstrated Japanese capabilities when properly planned and executed, but it could not disguise or diminish the magnitude of the strategic defeat they were accepting. Japanese forces deployed to Guadalcanal over the course of the campaign reached a peak strength of approximately 36,000 personnel from all services. Of these troops, roughly 25,000 to 30,000 died on the island, with approximately 14,800 killed in actual combat and another 10,000 to 15,000 dying from disease, starvation, and the indirect effects of the horrific conditions. American casualties were also severe, but critically they were sustainable, given American industrial capacity and manpower reserves. The Marines and Army units that fought on Guadalcanal lost approximately 1,600 men killed in action, 4,200 wounded seriously enough to require evacuation, and several thousand more temporarily disabled by tropical diseases, but who eventually returned to duty. American industry and mobilization could replace these losses easily. New divisions were already in training pipelines. Ships and aircraft were being produced faster than combat could possibly destroy them. The strategic initiative in the Pacific War had permanently and irreversibly shifted from Japan to the United States. The psychological impact of Guadalcanal on Japanese military thinking simply cannot be overstated when examining how the campaign affected subsequent Japanese strategy and operations. For the first time in the war, Japanese ground forces had been decisively defeated in sustained combat operations. Every single offensive operation they launched had failed completely. Every attempt to apply traditional Japanese tactical doctrine, emphasizing night attacks, close combat, and spiritual power, overcoming material disadvantages, had resulted in catastrophic casualties and failure to achieve objectives. The revelation that American forces were not merely materially superior, but were also tactically competent, well led by experienced officers, and fully capable of enduring absolutely terrible conditions while maintaining combat effectiveness, shattered fundamental pre-war assumptions about American military capabilities. Japanese officers who survived Guadalcanal and later wrote memoirs or were interviewed extensively after the war ended consistently emphasized several recurring themes that appeared again and again in their accounts. First, they had completely and catastrophically underestimated American fighting qualities based on pre-war intelligence assessments that were simply wrong. Second, the disparity in equipment quality and logistics support was far greater than intelligence had ever suggested, or that senior commanders had been willing to believe. Third, Japanese logistics systems were fundamentally inadequate for conducting sustained operations against any enemy that controlled both sea and air approaches. Fourth, spiritual power and superior tactical skill, while important, were simply insufficient to overcome systematic disadvantages in firepower, supply, and resources when fighting a modern industrial opponent. Post-war accounts and interviews with Japanese veterans who had served on Guadalcanal and survived revealed remarkably consistent assessments of what they had learned through the experience. They had genuinely believed going into the campaign that they were superior warriors, better trained than American soldiers, more willing to accept death, more skilled at night fighting and close combat. But on Guadalcanal, they learned the hard way that modern warfare is ultimately decided not by individual warrior qualities, but by systems, by logistics, by the ability to concentrate and sustain firepower. The Americans had functional systems for absolutely everything that mattered, systems for supply that ensured troops received food and ammunition, systems for medical care that saved wounded men's lives, systems for artillery support that could deliver devastating fire missions within minutes of being requested, systems for air coordination that allowed ground troops to call in airstrikes. Every single one of these systems functioned reliably day after day, Japanese systems failed comprehensively because they had never been built properly in the first place, designed as they were for short campaigns against weaker opponents rather than sustained attritional warfare against industrial powers. Japanese veterans interviewed decades after the war provided remarkably candid assessments that directly contradicted official Japanese military explanations for the defeat. They openly acknowledged that American forces had fought superbly, especially when defending prepared positions at night where Japanese doctrine claimed superiority. They admitted that Americans had endured malaria, dysentery, and absolutely terrible conditions while somehow maintaining combat effectiveness because their logistics systems continued supporting them even in the worst circumstances. They recognized with the clarity that only personal experience provides that American firepower was simply overwhelming when properly coordinated and precisely delivered. A single American infantry battalion possessed more effective firepower through its organic weapons and available fire support than an entire Japanese regiment could bring to bear. The technical aspects of American material superiority become starkly apparent when examining the actual weapons both sides employed during the campaign. Japanese forces on Guadalcanal fought primarily with Arisaka Type 38 and Type 99 rifles, both bolt-action weapons requiring manual cycling between each shot, reliable and accurate enough, but fundamentally limited in firepower compared to semi-automatic weapons. American Marines initially carried M19903 Springfield rifles, also bolt-action weapons nearly identical in capability to Japanese rifles, but these were increasingly supplemented and eventually largely replaced by the M1 Garand semi-automatic rifle as production ramped up and more became available. The Garand's 8-round en-bloc clip and semi-automatic operation that allowed firing as fast as you could pull the trigger provided decisive advantages in any kind of firefight where volume of accurate fire mattered. Machine guns revealed even starker disparities in capability and battlefield effectiveness. The American M1917A1 Browning was water-cooled and could genuinely sustain continuous fire indefinitely as long as water for cooling and ammunition for firing remained available. Japanese machine guns, primarily the Type 96 and Type 99 light machine guns, were lighter and theoretically more portable for jungle warfare, but they completely lacked the sustained fire capability that defensive positions demanded. In any kind of static defensive fighting, this difference became absolutely decisive in determining outcomes. Artillery superiority was perhaps the single most significant technical factor favoring American forces. The 11th Marines operated M1A1 pack howitzers that could be broken down into individual loads and transported through even the densest jungle terrain by pack animals or by hand when necessary. These 75mm weapons provided responsive, accurate fire support that could be delivered within minutes of being requested. Forward observers embedded with infantry units could call for fire missions using portable radios and receive rounds on target almost immediately. Japanese artillery on Guadalcanal was severely limited in number, extraordinarily difficult to move through jungle terrain, and chronically short of ammunition because the destroyer runs simply couldn't deliver enough shells. Artillery fire support that American battalions took for granted was a rare luxury for Japanese forces that had to carefully husband every shell. Naval gunfire support added yet another dimension of firepower that Japanese forces had absolutely no way to match, given American control of the seas during daylight. Destroyers and cruisers positioned offshore could deliver bombardments on Japanese positions whenever requested, or provide responsive fire support for Marine ground units engaged in combat. Radio communication between shore-based observers and naval ships offshore allowed relatively precise targeting of concentrations or strong points. Air power became increasingly dominant and one-sided as the campaign progressed through its 6-month duration. The Cactus Air Force, operating from Henderson Field under absolutely terrible conditions with inadequate parts, limited fuel, and constant Japanese attacks, gradually but decisively established air superiority over Guadalcanal and the surrounding waters. Marine and Army Air Force pilots flying F-4F Wildcat fighters, P-39 Airacobra, and P-40 Warhawk fighters intercepted Japanese bomber raids attempting to destroy Henderson Field. SBD Dauntless dive bombers struck Japanese positions on the ground, supply concentrations, and attempted Tokyo Express runs. Japanese air forces operating from Rabaul had to fly at the extreme limits of their combat radius, giving them minimal time over target and leaving them vulnerable during the long flight home if they were damaged. The final American ground offensive, launched in January 1943, demonstrated with mathematical clarity how completely the balance of forces had shifted in American favor. Major General Alexander Patch's 14th Corps, now including both Marine and Army divisions with full artillery and air support, launched coordinated attacks that systematically reduced the remaining Japanese defensive positions one after another. The offensive enjoyed overwhelming support from artillery that could fire essentially unlimited ammunition, air power that struck any concentration Japanese forces attempted to form, and naval gunfire that could be called upon whenever particularly stubborn resistance developed. Japanese resistance, while still determined because Japanese soldiers continued fighting with courage even when their situation was hopeless, was fundamentally hampered by starvation that left men too weak to fight effectively, disease that incapacitated entire units, and ammunition shortages so severe that many positions had only a few rounds per rifle. On February 9, 1943, American patrols pushing forward discovered to their initial surprise that Japanese forces had completely evacuated their positions during the previous nights. General Patch sent his famous message to Admiral Halsey that would officially mark the campaign's end. Tokyo Express no longer has terminus on Guadalcanal. The 6-month campaign was finally over. It had resulted in the first major American ground victory against Japanese forces in the Pacific War. More importantly for the war's subsequent trajectory, it had established operational patterns and revealed strategic truths that would fundamentally shape all subsequent American campaigns across the Pacific. The lessons that Japanese survivors carried away from Guadalcanal were absolutely devastating to pre-war Japanese military doctrine and assumptions. The carefully cultivated myth of Japanese warrior superiority had been comprehensively shattered by events. Individual courage and superior tactical skill at the small unit level, while admirable and sometimes effective, proved utterly inadequate against systematic disadvantages in firepower, logistics, and industrial support. Night attacks and aggressive close combat, the absolute hallmarks of Japanese tactical doctrine that had produced victories against Chinese and British forces, failed repeatedly and catastrophically against American defensive positions that had been prepared to receive them. Supply and logistics, which Japanese doctrine had treated almost as secondary administrative concerns, were revealed to be absolutely fundamental requirements for sustaining any kind of combat operations. Air and naval superiority, rather than being merely supporting factors, were shown to determine outcomes on land regardless of how bravely ground troops fought. These lessons learned in blood and starvation and defeat on Guadalcanal should have produced fundamental reforms in Japanese military thinking and strategy. Some perceptive officers did recognize the implications for future operations. Colonel Masanobu Tsuji, a notorious staff officer who visited Guadalcanal during the campaign and observed conditions firsthand, wrote afterward in reports to higher headquarters that Japan needed to completely reassess its overall strategic approach. The Americans, he observed with accuracy born from direct observation, were fighting an industrial war where material production and logistical sustainment determined outcomes regardless of tactical skill or fighting spirit. Japan simply could not win an industrial war of attrition against American productive capacity that dwarfed Japanese capabilities by factors of 10 or 20 in most critical areas. But Japanese military culture, built on generations of tradition and buttressed by recent victories that seemed to validate existing doctrine, simply could not easily accept such fundamental revision of core beliefs. The official explanation for the Guadalcanal defeat that emerged from Imperial General Headquarters blamed inadequate naval support, insufficient supplies delivered to ground forces, and the unexpected strength of American defenses that intelligence had failed to properly assess. This explanation carefully avoided acknowledging that Japanese tactical doctrine itself was fundamentally flawed for modern warfare, that the entire conception of combat that had served Japan reasonably well against China was completely obsolete when applied against a modern industrial opponent with functional logistics. Those Japanese soldiers who survived Guadalcanal and were later captured during other campaigns, or who survived the entire war and returned to Japan, became witnesses to a transformation they had never expected to experience. They had entered the Guadalcanal campaign as confident warriors of what they believed was an invincible empire destined to dominate Asia. They left as starving, disease-ridden survivors of a catastrophic defeat that had killed most of their comrades. Many of these survivors later described Guadalcanal in post-war interviews as the precise moment when they first truly understood in their hearts that Japan was going to lose the war regardless of how bravely soldiers fought or how many died trying. Post-war testimonies collected from Japanese veterans over many decades captured this psychological transformation with remarkable consistency. They acknowledged learning fundamental truths that military leaders had hidden from them or refused to acknowledge themselves. The Americans were not weak soldiers made soft by easy living, as propaganda claimed. They were overwhelmingly strong, not just in weapons and equipment, but in organization, in logistics, in leadership quality, and in their ability to sustain combat operations under conditions that would have broken less capable forces. Japanese forces had fought with extraordinary courage and skill that even their enemies acknowledged and respected. But courage and skill did not matter when facing systematic disadvantages that made victory impossible, regardless of how hard men tried or how willingly they died. The American perspective on Guadalcanal, while different in its specifics, reached equally important conclusions about the campaign's significance. For the Marines and soldiers who fought there and survived, the campaign provided definitive proof that American forces could match Japanese troops in the absolute brutality of jungle combat when properly trained, equipped, and led. The mythology of Japanese invincibility that had grown after Pearl Harbor and the Philippines was completely destroyed by events on Guadalcanal. American defensive doctrine, emphasizing prepared positions, interlocking fields of fire, and concentrated firepower, worked exactly as designed when executed by competent troops. Combined arms coordination, integrating infantry, artillery, air power, and naval gunfire, proved devastatingly effective when all elements functioned together. Individual American soldiers and Marines, when properly trained and adequately equipped, were demonstrably more than capable of defeating Japanese forces in any kind of combat, whether defensive or offensive. But American veterans also developed genuine respect for Japanese soldiers as extraordinarily tough, incredibly determined, highly skilled adversaries who would continue fighting to the death rather than surrender even when their situation became completely hopeless. The willingness of Japanese forces to keep attacking despite casualties that would break any other army, to endure starvation rather than give up, to choose death rather than retreat or surrender, made a profound and lasting impression on Americans who fought against them. The contrast between how the two sides approached the fundamental question of prisoner welfare and surrender illustrated deep cultural differences that affected everything from tactical doctrine to strategic planning. American forces made genuine efforts to encourage Japanese surrender by dropping leaflets describing humane treatment, broadcasting radio messages promising food and medical care to those who gave up, offering actual medical treatment and adequate food to the few prisoners who were taken. These efforts achieved minimal success because Japanese military culture taught that surrender was the ultimate disgrace and that captured soldiers had fundamentally dishonored themselves, their families, their units, and their nation. Of the approximately 36,000 Japanese troops who served on Guadalcanal during the campaign, fewer than 1,000 were captured alive, and most of those were so sick or so severely wounded that they were physically incapable of resisting capture or committing suicide. The strategic implications of Guadalcanal extended far beyond the island itself, or even the Solomon Islands campaign that would continue for another year. Japan's failure to retake Henderson Field and the eventual evacuation of all forces from the island demonstrated conclusively that the Japanese defensive perimeter could be penetrated by determined Allied offensives. This realization fundamentally altered Allied strategic planning, shifting from purely defensive operations designed to hold what remained after early Japanese conquests to increasingly ambitious offensive campaigns designed to progressively roll back Japanese territorial gains. The industrial and material advantages that the United States possessed could be translated systematically into military victories if applied with competent leadership and sound tactical doctrine. For Japan, Guadalcanal marked the beginning of an irreversible decline from which recovery became impossible. The loss of experienced troops who simply could not be replaced with equally trained personnel, the loss of irreplaceable naval pilots who required years to train properly, and the loss of ships that Japanese industry could not replace at anything approaching the rate American shipyards were producing new vessels, all combined to create a situation where Japanese military power could only decrease while American power increased with each passing month. The decision to evacuate Guadalcanal admitted, however quietly and however much official statements tried to disguise it, that Japan fundamentally could not sustain attritional warfare against American industrial might. The veterans of Guadalcanal from both sides carried their experiences with them for the rest of their lives, and those experiences shaped how they understood warfare, courage, and the relationship between individual heroism and systemic advantages. American Marines and soldiers who survived the campaign became the cadre for new units being formed, passing along hard-won lessons about jungle warfare, defensive tactics, the importance of artillery coordination, and how to fight an enemy who refused to quit even when defeat was obvious. The 1st Marine Division, pulled off Guadalcanal in December 1942 in a condition that shocked the rear echelon officers who saw them disembark, required many months of rest, rehabilitation, medical treatment, and intensive training before returning to combat operations. Japanese survivors faced an even grimmer future than their American counterparts. Those soldiers evacuated during Operation K in February 1943 were dispersed to various other units throughout the Pacific Theater, carrying with them the psychological burden of catastrophic defeat and the certain knowledge that American forces were far more formidable in every measurable way than pre-war propaganda and intelligence assessments had ever suggested. Many of these Guadalcanal veterans would die in subsequent battles on New Guinea, in the Philippines, on Pacific Islands, whose names meant nothing before the war, but which would become synonymous with savage combat, as Japan's strategic position continued its inevitable deterioration. The island of Guadalcanal itself bore the visible scars of 6 months of continuous intense combat for many decades afterward, and in some areas those scars remain visible even today. Wrecked aircraft, both American and Japanese, destroyed vehicles and equipment, abandoned defensive positions, and unexploded ordnance littered the jungles and coastal areas, creating hazards that would take generations to fully clear. Henderson Field, massively expanded and improved during and immediately after the campaign, served as a major Allied air base for subsequent operations throughout the Solomon Islands, supporting the campaigns that would eventually isolate and neutralize the major Japanese base at Rabaul. For military historians and strategic analysts studying the Pacific War, Guadalcanal provided invaluable case studies in amphibious operations conducted under difficult conditions, jungle warfare between competent opponents, the critical importance of logistics in sustaining combat operations, effective integration of air and ground operations, and the absolutely essential role of naval power in supporting and sustaining land campaigns. The campaign demonstrated with brutal clarity that modern warfare required far more than brave soldiers and superior small unit tactics. Victory demanded industrial capacity to produce weapons and equipment, effective logistics to deliver supplies where needed, technological superiority in key areas like radar and communications, and most fundamentally, the ability to sustain operations over extended periods while replacing losses faster than combat inflicted them. The human cost of Guadalcanal was absolutely staggering when examined from both sides. More than 7,000 American and Japanese servicemen died in the naval battles fought around the island, ships sinking in the dark waters taking their crews with them. On land, American casualties exceeded 7,000 killed, wounded, or missing across all services that participated. Japanese losses exceeded 30,000 from all causes, including combat, disease, and starvation. Thousands more on both sides suffered from diseases and physical conditions that would affect their health for the remainder of their lives, even if they survived the war. But from a purely strategic perspective, the terrible cost could be justified, at least according to military logic that measures success by objectives achieved rather than lives lost. Guadalcanal represented the critical turning point where Allied forces shifted permanently from defensive operations to offensive campaigns throughout the Pacific. It demonstrated conclusively that Japan could be defeated in ground combat by American forces when those forces were properly equipped, trained, and supported. It established patterns of air and naval superiority that would characterize the remainder of the Pacific War. The story of Japanese troops encountering American jungle warfare on Guadalcanal is ultimately a story about the violent collision between two fundamentally incompatible approaches to modern industrial warfare: incompatible philosophies that could not coexist, and which therefore had to fight until one completely defeated the other. One side believed absolutely in the supremacy of warrior spirit, in courage and training, overcoming material disadvantages, in superior tactics producing victory regardless of resources available. The other side believed in systematic application of industrial power, in logistics and firepower as force multipliers, in combined arms coordination as the essential key to success on modern battlefields. The jungle of Guadalcanal became the crucible where these conflicting philosophies met in sustained combat over 6 months. The outcome, though it required 6 months of absolutely brutal fighting to reach its inevitable conclusion, demonstrated beyond any possible argument that concentrated firepower and reliable logistics, when combined with competent tactics and determined soldiers, created a form of military power that Japanese forces employing traditional doctrine simply could not match or overcome. For the Japanese soldiers who survived Guadalcanal and lived long enough to tell their stories decades later, the campaign represented the traumatic moment when reality destroyed comforting illusions they had believed without question. They learned that their training had been based on false assumptions about how Americans would fight. Their tactics had been designed for a different kind of war against different kinds of enemies. Their logistics had been inadequate from the very beginning of the campaign, and their nation was engaged in a conflict it could not possibly win through military means alone, regardless of how bravely soldiers fought or how many died trying. The Americans who fought on Guadalcanal learned different but equally important lessons through their 6 months in hell. They discovered that they could match Japanese soldiers in the absolute brutality of close combat. They proved that American industrial power could be systematically translated into military victories when properly applied. They developed tactics and operational doctrine for jungle warfare that would serve them well in subsequent campaigns throughout the Pacific. And they comprehensively shattered the myth of Japanese invincibility, replacing it with a realistic assessment of a tough, determined, skillful, but ultimately defeatable enemy who could be worn down and destroyed through sustained application of American advantages. Guadalcanal was where Japanese troops first experienced genuine terror, not of American soldiers as individual fighters, though they proved themselves formidable opponents, but terror of the systematic, overwhelming, absolutely relentless application of firepower and material resources that American forces brought to every single engagement, large or small. It was a terror born not from fear of death, which Japanese soldiers had been trained from childhood to accept as honorable when serving their emperor, but from the terrible realization that personal courage and individual sacrifice were rendered meaningless against an enemy whose supplies never ran out, whose wounded received life-saving medical care, whose artillery never stopped firing no matter how many shells they expended, whose aircraft controlled the skies completely, and whose industrial base could replace losses faster than combat operations could possibly inflict them. The transformation that began when Japanese forces first encountered American jungle warfare on Guadalcanal marked a fundamental and permanent shift in the Pacific War's trajectory, from which Japan would never recover. From that point forward in the conflict, Japanese forces would be fighting defensive battles while steadily retreating, conducting a losing campaign against an enemy whose material advantages grew larger with each passing month as American industrial production reached levels that would have seemed impossible before the war. The jungle warfare of Guadalcanal became the template and proving ground for future American campaigns throughout the Pacific, demonstrating conclusively that American forces could fight and win in the most difficult terrain imaginable against a determined enemy, provided they maintained adequate logistics, effective coordination between all arms, and the ability to bring overwhelming firepower to bear at decisive points and moments.